Hello and welcome to this broadcast, as we used to say in the old days, but that's wireless. We're not talking wireless now, are we? Welcome to this webinar. Welcome to this webinar from the BCS, British Computer Society, which is the Chartered Institute of IT. And this particular session is put on by North London branch and London Central branch of the BCS. And I have the very fortunate position of being the chair of both of those groups. But I'm joined this evening by some very illustrious colleagues, Kate Marshall, and Paul Nebel, who's there, and also voice in the background you might hear occasionally, which is David Grundy. We are all in the BCS, but we have some fabulous guests who aren't yet in the BCS, and we'll be hearing lots of great things from them. What about the meta what? Well, this is about the metaverse. You may know all about the metaverse, in which case you're a very valuable member of the audience. I hope you will ask questions and make statements as we go through, or you may not. We are going to learn more, lots more this evening. You can see the details of our great speakers there on screen for you, but we are indeed going to take a journey into a new world, into the metaverse. And my main guide for this session is Kate Marshall. So with that, I would like to hand over to you, Kate, to introduce your colleagues and lead us through this session. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Dallin, for the introduction. So yes, hopefully you all know why we're here today. We're here to talk about the metaverse, and for this event we've invited three wonderful speakers to join us. We'll just take a minute to introduce ourselves first and foremost. So our hosts today are myself and my colleague Paul. I'll introduce myself first and I'll ask Paul to introduce himself. Oh, has my screen just stopped sharing? Hopefully it's back on my main thing now. So yes, to introduce myself first of all, I am a volunteer with the BCS and I'm on the North London branch committee. It's a wonderful team of people, so if you are interested in joining, please get in touch with Dallin, myself or Paul. As my day job, as it were, I do work for IBM. I work very closely with Chris, who's on the call today. I work at IBM in two capacities, first and foremost as a developer and DevOps engineer, and secondly as an IBM Quantum Ambassador and the Global Technical Ambassador Lead for IBM Quantum. So if you have any questions about Quantum, I'm happy to reach out to you separately about that as well. I'm also joined today by my colleague and friend, Paul, who's another host. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Kate. So I've been a professional software engineer in one form or another for at least the last 25 years. And for the last 6 or 7 years, my specialism has been in startups, specifically innovative, technologically based startups. Up until a year ago, I was working for a company called Geovation, which is the open innovation branch of Ordnance Survey, the national mapping organization of the United Kingdom. And for the last year, I have been acting in the same role, but independently for myself, as a fractional CTO and business advisor to startups, specifically in the social good or environmental good sector. And I've been working recently with Kate because we both have an interest in startups and accelerators and hubs and how they work and contribute to the work of the BCS and of society in general, which has led us to this point of asking, what is the metaverse, Web 3.0? And to help us answer that question, we have three wonderful and illustrious panelists who I will ask to introduce themselves in no particular order other than the one they happen to appear in on my screen. So Esther, can I ask you first to introduce yourself, please?
I'm CEO, co-founder of Hundo .careers, and we are building the world's first learn-to-earn platform for Gen Z to upskill for the future of work in Web3 and Metaverse, but also more broadly looking at what does the future of work actually look like over the next couple of decades, because it's so radically transforming from what we've all been used to up till now.
Absolutely, thank you. Laura.
Hi everyone, so my name is Laura. I am the Head of Programme for Tech and Innovation at TechUK. For those of you who don't know, TechUK is the UK's tech trade association. We help represent many UK tech businesses and showcase how technology is helping the UK's society, the UK's economy, and of course the planet as well. I work across a number of different technologies, which would fall very broadly into the category of tech and innovation. This can be everything from cloud to edge computing to maybe some of the technologies which seem a little bit further down the line. So technologies like Kate's working in quantum, or like we're here to discuss today, Metaverse.
Fantastic, thank you, Laura. And Christopher, would you care to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Hayes. I'm an IBM Distinguished Engineer. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for IBM iX, which is our customer transformation and digital transformation services division in IBM. So in my past, so as you've probably seen from the profile there, back in sort of 2006, I was one of the original developers for M-Pesa, and I led the architecture for M-Pesa in Africa for many, many years. And so that's sort of given me a pretty good idea of, how banking can transform the world, because I sort of lived and breathed that for a long time. Within IX, I spent a lot of time in lots of digital technologies, from cloud to web, and recently I spent quite a bit of time working with clients on their journey into the metaverse as well.
Fantastic, thank you very much, all three. Kate, I'm going to hand back to you now to introduce our first questions.
Perfect, thank you so much, Paul. And to all our speakers for introducing themselves as well. So the way we're going to run this session today is we have, I think, 6 prepared questions. We don't necessarily have to cover all of them, but we will first answer those questions, and then in the last 10 minutes we'll also take questions from the audience. So if you do have questions that come up during our discussion, please post them on the question functionality on the app here, and we will see them and address them at the end of the event. If you do have points that you'd like to raise, also use the chat functionality, and we will try and keep our eye on that too. Paul and I are just going to take turns in answering the questions, and we will keep an eye on the time for the sake of the speakers here as well. So definitely not trying to cut you off, but just need to try and cover as many of the questions as we have planned as possible. So on that note, I will share the next set of slides here. So the very first question we're going to ask our panelists today, and for the panelists' benefit, if you can, we're keen to make this as conversational as possible. So do just jump in if you have a comment. The first question we'd like to ask is, what is the difference between Web 2.0 and Web 3.0?
I'm happy to go first at taking a little bit of a stab on this, but obviously, please all the other speakers, please feel free to come in and please do correct me if I'm wrong. So the differences between all these terms, so what is the difference between Web 2.0, Web 3.0, and then the metaverse? It can get a little bit complex, especially if it's not necessarily an area that you've worked in excessively. But put simply, Web 3.0 is just the next iteration of the internet. So if you envision mid-2000s Web 2.0, that is basically been driven by the need for social interaction and very much a focus on sharing and engaging with content. And it was also very much spurred by the creation of social media and the creation of different social media accounts and how we were interacting with the friends and people that we knew online. And of course, this had a number of consequences in terms of different tech companies that were able to kind of grow and form out of 2.0. Web 3.0 is kind of a follow-on from that. It's a response to some of the things that have definitely worked well with 2.0, but obviously a response to some of the challenges that have also arisen from 2.0. So in my opinion, Web 3.0 is very much a focus on individual autonomy over content sharing or data sharing. It's very much about a decentralized approach to the internet, and it's also very much about being an active shareholder in the governance of what would happen on the version of 3.0 internet. Very quickly before the other speakers come in, there is also a slight difference, in my opinion, in the difference between 3.0 and the metaverse as well. So if you kind of view the metaverse as kind of the concept and the sorry, if you view 3.0 as kind of the concept and the idea behind the next generation of the internet, in my opinion, metaverse is kind of the way that you would then interact with that new version of the internet and kind of the more immersive angle of it. So that's kind of my starter for 10, but I'll stop there for a second.
So it's pretty much, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much how I see it. What I would add to it is, I think it's tremendous fun to be in Web3, and although there are, you know, we have got some legacy stuff around a lack of diversity inclusion, you know, predominantly, you know, that Web2 has within it. It is a, you know, for me as someone coming into the space, not with the backgrounds that Lauren and Chris have, as a non-technical person, it is a much more open, accessible place to start, and that's one of the things that I like about it. And I think it's not perfect, but I think some of the, if it can sort of start to tackle some of the worst excesses that have been created with Web2, with that very centralized, you know, data ownership in the hands of the few, rather than itself sovereign data in the hands of the many, making decisions about how they want to, you know, live, learn, work and earn online, and in those different environments. That for me is the bit of it that's really exciting, and also the possibility of the creator economy that's coming out of it. Particularly, obviously, I can only speak, you know, from my own expertise, which was tackling youth unemployment, youth issues, and Web3, you know, things like crypto literacy as an alternative source of finance. You know, those are the bits of Web3 that I am excited about, because they offer the possibility of change.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to ask Chris if you had a thought on this one too.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to that as well. And for me, I think decentralization is the key there. And I love what everybody said there, and I agree 100%. And in some regards, I sort of, you know, think about kind of Web 1.0, right, where in those terms it was a little bit raw and everybody kind of creating things. And then, as you said there, sort of Web 2.0, it all got very sort of central tech and it really became about platforms at that point and centralization, and again, sort of Web3 is being a little raw again, is sort of decentralizing quite a bit and opens up that creator economy, and that's what I'm excited about, right? Because I think that's getting back to sort of the original intention of the web in the first place. So I'm super excited about that. You know, I worry, right? I worry about Web. I'm gonna say it right, but I worry about Web 4, right? Where, you know, do we end up back in a space where we bring the decentralized technologies and then it gets platformized again, and that is obviously a sort of a concern for me. But at the moment it feels good. It's nice and raw, and I think it's important as well, right? So I think when we consider things like censorship and that side of things, and how we've got a sort of a changing world economy and shifting borders, etc., then decentralized actually is important. So I mean, a good example, we only need to look at sort of you know, the situation in Ukraine, and the fact that the BBC are taking their website and they've got the torrent version of that site, and folks can access that, right, and sort of not be shut down by any sort of particular platform. So I think it's a wonderful and interesting space to be in, and again, to come on to the kind of metaverse piece, I think the thing that is sort of different there, technology's kind of moved on a little bit there, but this sort of shared and connected worlds and being able to hop between different platforms, I think is going to be really important. And yeah, exciting space.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. So we'll move on to the next question, which Paul, I'll let you introduce.
Thank you. So what will Web 3.0 mean to me, both as an individual and as a business, someone who takes part in business or perhaps owns a business? In other words, what changes can I expect to see, and why are they important? Why do they matter to me?
So I think, from our side, World Economic Forum, 1 billion new tech roles needed by 2030. And this is kind of where, Web 2, Web 3 starts to cross over, because, it's not like there's going to be some giant immediate, there's not a switch that goes, right, it's now all Web 3. So we're going to have this kind of layering effect that's going to roll for a period of time. But I think it's about, certainly, again, coming back to my own experience, when I talk to people kind of within my age group, and you talk about things like blockchain, quantum, computing, AI, ML, it's scary. So for individuals, and they feel very isolated and not part of it, which is quite sad. Whereas obviously when we're dealing with a kind of a Gen Z or a Gen A even audience, they're digital natives, so a lot of these concepts are much easier for them to grasp. So I think for individuals, it's really about jargon busting and trying to, and trying to look at reference points that are familiar, and descriptors. And I think for businesses, as we see it, a lot of the foundation, the foundation stuff that I've referenced, things like AI, ML, diagnostics, all of that layer of technology is, it's going to start to underpin pretty much every industry. So I think Web3 isn't just about tech, companies. It's kind of going, you will see it in architecture, you will see it in digital construction. We're seeing it in health and social care, where nursing staff, care home staff will have to have a basic level of technical proficiency to do iPad, AI, ML diagnostics, for healthcare. So I think that it's probably more, it is emerging and it's nascent, but I think it's probably more embedded and established in people's daily lives than they might actually realise. That was certainly the case for me.
Yeah, I think definitely just to pick up on something that Esther is saying there, the move towards 3.0, it's going to be iterative, right? You're not going to wake up one day as a virtual avatar without a physical presence wearing your digital Nikes. So the change, obviously it's emerging and it's exciting, but it's not going to be an overnight change. It's something that's going to be quite slow in the sense that it's something that isn't going to happen straight away. But the key thing is we don't truly know as an individual the shape that is going to take in its end form. Christopher there was saying that we've got this really great exciting time about 3.0, but what happens in 4.0, and it kind of circles all back around. The truth is we don't really know. Yeah. What I envision and kind of what I'm expecting there is you will kind of start to see a slow process where you'll start to have a greater understanding of your own online presence. You'll start to become a little bit more aware of all this data that you have previously been passively creating. You'll start to become a bit more aware as to where that's going and how that's being used, and then also maybe a little bit more control over that through your eventual adoption of DLT technologies. That's how I kind of see it growing as an individual. From a business perspective, definitely we're going to start to see the emergence of this term, which is the Industrial Metaverse, which is essentially how we're going to see 3D renderings of physical objects in the virtual world. And that's going to be so nascent in industrial manufacturing, in automotive. We're already seeing that kind of emerging anyway, and that's going to be really exciting. But one area where I think is going to be potentially just really cool is how businesses are going to start eventually commercializing and moving into the metaverse. What kind of business skills are going to be needed there, and what kind of new business opportunities are going to open through the metaverse in like a B2C commercial aspect as well. So I think lots of different changes to kind of summarize, but it's not going to be like a light switch. It's going to be a slower process.
Right.
No, thank you for that, Laura. I'm just interested whether Chris or Esther, whether your exploration of the metaverse and businesses as today, because I know you've both probably explored this to some extent, is there any examples you could give where you've seen what Laura just described in practice?
Yeah, and I'll just add on to, and I think they were sort of great examples. So I mean, if I think about even what we're doing within IBM, right, and only kind of a couple of weeks ago, we've been doing a whole bunch of meetings in the metaverse, and it's been really exciting actually. We've had I remember one of the last ones we had around 50 different people, all from different countries of the world, all coming together, right? And we're still in this sort of pandemic situation, right? But it kind of felt really good, right? We felt close to to everyone. We had a kind of centralized area where we were sort of talking about some presentation elements, and then we could teleport into some breakout rooms, and then we could start doing some design thinking, put some post-it notes up, do some collaboration, come back and then present. So this ability to just collaborate in a more natural way in the metaverse was better than you would have in a sort of flat 2D kind of space there, and it was more like a physical environment. So I think that was pretty good, and that of course opens up its own challenges. From a kind of business perspective, I think it's really interesting kind of what we're seeing there, which is, and the biggest thing I would say is, and I love what Laura was saying about sort of this incremental approach, because that's actually what we talk about with our customers, right? Which is the investments that you make in your digital platforms today is what is going to enable to be able to play in that sort of Web3 world and that metaverse world. And therefore, and I don't want to get too technical for a second, but sort of investing in that API economy and having those sort of key building blocks. So if you are building up a commerce service today, being able to sort of set yourself up to be headless, to have that multi-channel capability, and then plug into your multiple all your multiple systems within your digital platforms is important. So if you start to do that investment today, then really when you think about it, you're moving into the metaverse, you can start opening up other channels. And that could be the fact that you start representing virtual avatars that represent your business, understanding what your tone of voice is going to be in the metaverse. How, even things like virtual assistants where you have sort of AI QA technologies, setting yourself up so that when you move into those space, you're preparing yourself for the future. And then even if we talk about sort of the kind of the crypto piece, I mean, let's going to be honest, the average person is not going to be wanting to sort of go, oh my goodness, I'm going to go buy an NFT. How do I do this? And I've got to go, I've got to get myself a wallet. I've got to understand blockchain. It's really scary stuff, right? As Esther was saying. And actually sort of starting to bridge that gap when you start to think about your payment systems, how they plug into your existing commerce platforms, right? And you can even look at, folks like Shopify today, which is even offering, I think they're beta and NFTs within Shopify platform using traditional payment methods. So as you start to invest in those types of technologies and kind of platforms, right, you are sort of incrementally moving in, as Laura's saying. So it's not necessarily that big leap, but you're starting to bridge that gap between these worlds. And I think that, in my opinion, is the movement that we're going to see. I think that's already happening today, right? And that's and I'm being frank. That's what I'm talking to my customers about, right? So these things that we've been saying architecturally that you should have been doing for the last 2 years, guess what? It's going to be really important right now, right? And so that's kind of my view.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I think, Kate, we can move on to the next question because it leads on rather nicely from the previous one, not surprisingly.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. So yes, next question is, what does Web 3.0 imply for the training needs of a metaverse-enabled workforce?
Sorry to go first again. All right, so this is one of my questions, isn't it? So I think actually just pulling on from what Chris was saying, one of the biggest issues for for a user coming to this fresh and not from a background in tech it is a nightmare at the moment. The kind of the UX UI experience, you actually have to have some sort of technical proficiency. You've got these very trying to get from Coinbase or crypto.com, then you've got to set up a wallet, and then you've got to connect that to MetaMask, and then you've got all of these codes, and very long, and it's not user friendly, it's not mainstream, until it is. I mean, I think it will move rapidly. Obviously got MasterCard, HSBC, I think going into Sandbox, is it, or Decentraland at the moment. It will move, but I think that to achieve mainstream user adoption, the user experience has really got to improve quite substantially. And that goes hand in hand with with the training needs. And a lot of the for us, we look at unfortunately the kind of traditional education systems that exist at the moment. Chris, and you probably know this better than me, but by the time primary schools are teaching coding, we're into low code, no code. So it just can't keep pace with change, and that's why we're starting to see You know, the thing for me during COVID that was particularly awful for young people, they were losing their jobs at 3 to 5 times the rate of every other age group. But at the same time, big Web2 companies were crying out for software engineers, you know, develop $150,000 a year salaries. So there is this kind of systemic structural breakdown, and then you've got Web3 coming on even faster. So it's kind of going, I think, you know, as I say, digital natives, you know, the gaming life, you know, number of players on Axie Infinity is something like 1.8 million a day. Young people are working, living, learning, earning in this space already. So translating that into what a workforce looks like in many ways for a younger generation will be a bit easier. I think for kind of generations beyond that, trying to get them sort of reskilled, you know, being able to look at going, if you have where, you know, if you have digital marketing skills, you can probably go into Discord community server management if you know, and you'll have to upskill. So I think it's looking at it in that way, and actually getting out in front of it. You know, silo finance for a rank and file dev, $750,000. That is an unsustainable hiring market. When Meta announced Facebook, you know, rebranded to Meta, they announced 10,000 jobs in Europe, and my technical co-founder turned around and said there aren't 10,000 people in Europe with skills. So for Web3 to fulfill its true potential, one of the reasons that obviously Hundo is building campus is for exactly that reason. It's going, we have got to find a way to get out in front of this fast.
Just picking up on something really fascinating that Esther said then, is that we're kind of in this bit of an oxymoron, right, where we've got this digitally native younger population that's coming up, but ironically, according to a survey done by Accenture a couple of months ago, people taking IT at GCSE has dropped by 40% since 2015. And in my opinion, I please correct me if I'm wrong, Esther, I think that's possibly to do with the actual IT course just not suiting the needs of what young people are expecting from ICT anymore. And it's incredibly strange because my cousins, for example, during lockdown, the way that we all stayed in contact was through playing games on Discord and joining Among Us, but they're not necessarily interested in the traditional IT courses that they're kind of taking at high school. Just to kind of add, and I guess to summarize my ramblings there, my fear is that the move to Web 3.0 is just going to drastically exacerbate the digital skill shortage that we have here in the UK. And I can't, it's going to be so hard to try and get ahead of that. There's a couple of good examples where we are doing so. We have the AI Masters course in the UK, where people who don't necessarily have a background in AI can then upskill and take the AI Masters and then go from that to get a job that way. But yeah, the whole upskilling is a huge challenge right now, and I don't think it can be underplayed.
I think most young people, I was going to say, Chris, I think most young people don't do IT at school because it's called IT.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting one, right? So I mean, the first thing I would say there, and again, I just think about our kind of the hiring policy we had in IBM iX, right? And I'll be honest, we don't have a requirement on a computer science degree, right? So that's the first thing, right? In fact, it's a really interesting one, because actually there's certain aptitudes. So we focus more on kind of aptitude of an individual, and the reason we focus on that is that you can have passion, you can't teach that, right? You can have the willingness to learn, to be open, etc., right? They're the qualities that you're looking for. The actual digital skills, well, you can learn them anyway, right? So I think that's the kind of starting approach that we take, and it's certainly the approach I take on these things, because you can learn that. I kind of get your point on the university stuff. I mean, there is a lot of theoretical stuff, right, that happens on that. Whereas back to the point you were making earlier, Esther, right, which is in the creator economy, right, the sort of bite-sized learning, the learning stuff off of YouTube videos, taking your kind of Udemy courses, etc. That is really the kind of the way people are learning these days. And again, I mean, I experience that on my own channel as well on YouTube. I try and break things down to a level that people can kind of pick up those skills. But again, the other thing I would say is technology and frameworks move on at a super fast speed, right? So if you learn this thing today, and you know, in 2 years' time, that thing is probably not going to exist, or maybe in 3-4 years' time, it's not going to exist. So actually, I wouldn't be focusing on those technologies because they shift so much, right? But that passion, that willingness to learn, the ability to sort of keep moving forward, I think is the important thing. And yeah, and I take your point about kind of the salary ranges is getting crazy. But then the other way of looking at that is, look, there's real opportunity for people to pick up those skills, right, in a digitally native and creative way, and make use of that creative economy, and then jump in and sort of take it on. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of evolution on that. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Great.
So,
Paul, would you like to introduce the next question, if you think that's
yes, please, thank you. And just
right,
on
there we go.
a couple of things that were just mentioned. So in my role in Geovation, I came across quite a number of people who had just come out of university degrees. And it's unfortunate that I have to say that I was shocked in almost all cases by just how ill-equipped they were to actually do anything useful. It quite stunned me, I have to say. And thinking about the definition IT and an issue with IT, you could almost say, arguably, that Web 2.0 and everything leading up to it was about information technology, albeit that information was going to some very large but very few buckets that not many people could look into. And it's almost as though Web 3, it's not that the information has gone away, but the focus is now on something different. Perhaps you should call it social technology or something else. But yeah, IT seems to me to fall very firmly in Web 2.0. And that brings us on to the next question. To a certain extent, we've answered some of this, or rather you have answered some of this. What does Web 3.0 imply for digital inclusivity? And I think the part that's been partially addressed is, will my grandparents be able to use it? And we've had some discussion about people are going to have to get used to this kind of thing. But even allowing for the fact that we could get used to it, there is another issue, which is when we see people like Mark Zuckerberg as the obvious person to pick on here, putting forward this new technology and the idea of the metaverse. We see things like Oculus Rift, you know, these pieces of equipment which cost hundreds of pounds. What about the people who can't afford those things? Are they going to be excluded from Web3? How are we going to make sure that this isn't just something that's accessible to those who can afford to participate and take part?
Yeah, I'm maybe starting this if you don't mind. So I'm going to sort of go back a little bit in time. So, and I think it's a sort of important one. So when and digital inclusion is really important to me, right? So if I come back to our time sort of in PESA when we launched that back in sort of March 2007, it was a really interesting kind of world because we weren't talking about, if you think about 2007, right, the iPhone had just literally came out, I think it was June 2007 when we launched M-Pesa on March 2007. And so therefore, if you look at the evolution that M-Pesa had, right, it was based on SMS as a technology and it was based on feature phones, right? So sort of old Nokia phones. And actually, if you look in Africa today, you know, it's moved on to things like Androids, etc. But those feature phones are really sort of key. So here was an entire channel that was completely different. And it was about inclusion because actually the things that it enabled in Kenya was the ability to go hundreds of miles to go and work in a different city and then be able to transfer money, to be able to move from city to city safely, right? So one of the biggest use cases we weren't aware of this is people, you know, carrying cash on a journey was a really dangerous operation. So what people would do was take their money, right, put it into digitally into their digital wallet and M-Pesa, get on a bus, go to the other side of the country, right, and take the money out of the other side, right? So it created that safety and inclusion. It also meant that people could then because it was a real-time service, people could then start creating their own businesses, right? So we saw people who were taking these feature phones and then hooking them up into websites and running e-commerce sites off of by scraping the SMS messages that were coming back. And then that opened up into other platforms where people were able to build entire businesses like Mkopa, who built solar panels, etc. When we moved into something like Mshwari, which was about giving interest and being able to do banking off the back of that, right? It costs around $800 to open a bank account in Kenya, right? So the ability to bring that then that you could earn interest within seconds, the ability to ask for a loan in a safe way without going to brokers, opened up this economy that was incredible and amazing. And so when I think about Web3, and I think about Metaverse, right? I see that as an extension of this journey, right? Which is it's going to open up amazing abilities for people, as Esther was saying, like in the creator economy, the ability to go and launch your own business, the ability for people to be able to work from home, to create interesting new applications, right? The ability to transfer money across the world without centralization of banking platforms, et cetera, and currency costs. The ability to represent yourself in an environment the way that you wouldn't expect. So yes, there is always a barrier to entry for equipment, but then that's when we're sitting in the strict world of saying sort of VR, AR is your only entry point in there. And I don't think that will be the case. I think that as technology gets better, that cost of entry will come down. But then there will be, use of ambient technologies, right? So the ability to get into this side-by-side world, right, where we can exist in both at the same time. So I think that so Web3 technologies such as DeFi, crypto, etc., and the ability to have this multi-channel world, I think will actually increase inclusivity. There's going to be a bit of a barrier just now, but I've kind of seen this journey before, and I'm pretty convinced that we're going to be in this nice journey over the next 10 years. And that's my hope. Maybe I'm too much of an optimist.
No, I think following on from some of Chris's really great examples there, yes, not ignoring that there is going to be some inclusivity challenges in the coming years that definitely need to be addressed, but just a couple more examples where the technology which is going to support 3.0 is offering inclusivity. One that comes to mind, and yes, this is kind of the use of VR and AR, which does again have its own accessibility barriers. But you hear a lot about how we can use this technology to bring communities back together. So regeneration projects, just thinking about the Battersea Power Station here in London, they will use immersive experiences to retell the history of communities and groups who may not live around there anymore, but you can revisit and see what that life was like through immersive experiences and through the use of AR. I know they did something very similar in the Cardiff docks, so you could go and kind of see what the working class communities at the turn of the last century and in the early post-war period were kind of living like through immersive technologies. And I think that is just such an important kind of cultural phenomenon that 3.0 and technologies which are underpinning 3.0 is going to enable as well. Couple of other ones with DLT technologies. There's a couple of really great businesses who are doing amazing stuff. So AgriLedger, TechUK members, they're using DLT technologies to create transparency. So people who are kind of on their ledger, they're using farmers to make sure that they can get real-time notifications of weather changes, for example. And they're kind of allowing that transparency through DLT technologies, or even Circular, who are a DLT company using DLT technologies to create transparency for sustainability initiatives. So again, just a couple of examples building on Chris's really great point about how these technologies underpinning 3.0 can actually increase inclusivity.
Thank you.
I think as well the digital poverty is an issue now. It's not uniquely Web3 related, and I think while we're building a platform which is ultimately for young people to get work in Web3, it is very much accessible on YouTube, Twitch, an old iPhone, or an Android, because that is the technology that is available right now. Some of the things that I think are really useful though, which is because I, like you, Chris, I'm optimistic, because the alternative is, you know, pessimistic. So, but I think, you know, some of the really good use cases that I have seen for the power of this technology, you know, in a transformational way, with inclusivity at its heart. You know, in I think California, a prison where they had young men who went in when they were teenagers. They're 40, 50 years old, so all they've known is incarceration. ATMs didn't exist in the high street when they were sent down. So they go out into a world that is completely alien to them, reoffend to go back inside, and they're using AR and VR to reintegrate them in advance of leaving. You know, so there are some, you know, technology, like everything, is never bad of itself, you know, and I think there are some really good use cases coming through for, and I think it's, you know, will the grandparents, you know, grandparents struggle with mobile banking apps. You know, it's like my grandma was a speed typist, you know, in the army, you know, in the Second World War, on the big typewriters, but I could not get her to press play, pause, and record on a VHS, you know, no matter how hard I tried. So it is tough. You know, I think technology moves at a scarily rapid pace. Trying to make sure that everybody doesn't get left behind is, I don't know how we bridge that. I don't think we've ever managed to achieve that. So yeah.
No. And as a technology,
and I was just, sorry, go on, Paul.
I was just saying, as a technologist, it's even harder to keep pace.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about what we were saying there as well, right? Which is actually, we have a kind of responsibility already today, right? How many sites are not accessible? How many sites are sending down huge images, which mean you need great technology to do that? How often do we break browser compatibility? I mean, if I think of like Android phones, or if I think of iPhones, etc. today, right? So, you know, the compatibility is maybe 4 or 5 years, and then at that point you're not going to be able to download any apps from the App Store, right? And you're going to have to upgrade your phone, and that is, to your point, right? It's a Web 2 problem already, and we need to do better at that, right? We need to do better at not breaking the web. And I understand that things move on, and we have security and we have protocols, etc., to really fix things up, and things do need to be on. But to your kind of point, right? Who actually gets it in the neck? Well, actually, who gets it in the neck is those people who can't afford to buy the latest version of a smartphone. And I think they're the things that we need to do better at that. And therefore, in the way that we need to do better at that is sort of lean more into open technologies, lean more into open source, lean more into you know, having an open web. And I think and sort of less platformization. I think that's important, because that's going to bring inclusivity and accessibility as part of that. And I think we just need to keep it as we we move into this sort of third generation of the web, but let's try and not make some of the same mistakes as we made in the previous generations, right? But I doubt it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to move us on to the next question, if I may. Kate, over to you.
Of course. No, focusing on one group in particular now, and Esther, I know this is a topic close to your heart as well, but what is driving the move from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, and particularly what will push Generation Z to adopt this technology?
Chris, you do the first bit, or Laura, please.
I'm happy to start off, and
Okay.
I guess talking from personal experience. So I'm on the cusp of Gen Z. I'm that first year of Gen Z, and for me, so from my experience, my generation was the first people who kind of grew up with social media in your face. Like, I remember being in my first year of high school, and it was also the first year that like Facebook really became a thing. But so we have kind of been the pioneers of the opportunities that this kind of social media life can bring. And don't get me wrong, there's so many opportunities. The fact that I can, like, my mum lives 200 miles away, but I can just stay in contact with her and FaceTime her all the time is so brilliant. And that was especially true during the pandemic. But I've also seen the kind of negative effects that this constant in this life can bring, where you're spending all your time on social media and on the internet. And how some of the kind of platforms that we've been talking about can be inherently negative as your experience as a young person on the internet. And again, going to that whole, you don't know what's real on the internet, you don't know where your data is necessarily going on the internet. It's hard, right? And so I think the move towards 3.0 is definitely the younger generation being brought into something that they didn't necessarily have the autonomy to create because we were really young, and then going, hang on a second, this doesn't work for us anymore, and we want to create something that actually fits our ethics and fits our views and fits our needs as well. That's not unique to us. You see it all the time with like the changing of the high streets, change of like automobiles and anything, but that's just my experience anyway.
No, it's super. It's super relevant, and my son is just 18. So obviously he's the kind of COVID lockdown generation, and I've watched him, sort of his online life, his gaming life, in Roblox, in Minecraft, building worlds, building teams, in Clash of Clans, and then kind of sitting in this horrendous, sort of Zoom classroom, during lockdown, and they're not actually even having any GCSEs, because they didn't actually do them in the end. And it's sort of going that those two things are such a stark contrast. And I think pushing, I don't think Gen Z will get pushed into doing anything in my experience. I think it's more about I worked in young male suicide prevention and teenage self-harm for a period of time, and watching what the worst excesses of Web 2 have done to young people and their mental health, with very little protections, built in. I think that if Web 3 can offer, back to decentralization, back to more community driven, sort of, and even financially, it's sort of, crypto is an alternative source of currency. It is pretty much the only asset class that Gen Z and millennials can compete in, because they are outstripped by the generations before them in traditional asset classes. So I think there is actually a whole load of societal factors that are occurring around this particular generation. And I think the adoption of technology will come when the technology, as when we talked about before, when the kind of the user experience is improved quite substantially. But what I hope is that it becomes a very useful tool for this generation, and and obviously we're looking at Gen A, and beyond. My technical co-founder's son is 5 years old. By the time he's looking for work, affordable mainstream space tourism will probably be a big industry. Web3 can probably help with some of the augmented learning that they're going to need for that kind of thing in the future.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of add to that as well, which is I think Gen A is probably gonna be more interesting, because, as you say, right, kids are already kind of there, and they're sort of building platforms from Roblox, etc. And I think that's going to be interesting. From like kind of the driving the move from Web 2 to Web 3, and it was really great points you were making about kind of assets class of kind of crypto. But then I worry as well, right? And my worry is if we think about, I mean, if you just take sort of the proliferation of crypto coins that are coming out like there's no tomorrow, and the NFTs and the influencer culture, where they're essentially highly elaborate pump and dump schemes, and then is really just scamming money out of everyone. So in the same way as Web 2 is really harmful, in these very nascent stages of Web 3, then a lot of there's some very, very dodgy people, and most of them seem to have the surname of Paul, as far as I can tell, that are really sort of taking advantage of these scenarios. Now that will change over time, right? And then, of course, when yeah,
definitely, but I saw one lad on Twitter, and it made me laugh, because he was like, I spent, 3 years, doing a degree, didn't get a job, got $60,000 worth of debt, never got rugged for that much on the, for an NFT. And it's kind of going, it's controversial to say it, but I'm afraid it's true.
Yeah, it is true, yeah.
So that's
that hits close to home.
Which, interestingly enough, I think takes us rather nicely onto our next question. which is that given that I just worked it out, rather like Prince was TAFCAP, Meta is now TEFCAF, the enterprise formerly known as Facebook. They recently had to introduce a personal boundary into their Horizon VR product to prevent virtual harassment. How should Web3 address the existing challenges, some of which we've just been discussing, relating to online harm? And how might, does government, given that we're now talking about decentralization, does government or any body like that have a role to play in minimizing the effect of harm on people in this environment?
So this is obviously something I've worked in, so, child protection training. I'm a coach, so we have to go through this. And I'm afraid that, I left, I joined Facebook under duress in 2009 and left very quickly after, when I learned just how much of its software had enabled a massive increase in child trafficking. And I think that it's no surprise that rushing out this technology in a centralised way for shareholder benefit is going to continue to proliferate the issues that young people are, and actually, I'm sorry, it's not just young people, is it? Online harm, frankly. I'm not sure that any government policy affects this kind of change in any meaningful way. And if you want the most recent and dreadful example of that, we can look at the Child Q case. I think young people are singularly failed by government, by corporates, and I think that there is no silver bullet solution, unfortunately. I think there has to be better guardrails, better safeguarding, more what's the word I'm looking for? More transparency and education for parents. My son signed up for an account when he was 13, said he was 16. There's no verification process to say that someone isn't, so I think there is an element of putting in some guardrails. I'm hoping that things like blockchain, some of that stuff can actually start to help with some of this, but it is a very unfortunate byproduct of human nature. And I think all we end up doing really with technology is amplifying. And particularly if we don't fight back with things like, why do algorithms, we know this now, we've had whistleblowers telling us, that algorithms that amplify negative news, that amplify all of this stuff. I think as a collective of people who work in technology, there's an element of personal responsibility, accountability of how we build our systems to protect, effectively children, young people, and other, other generations.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. If you don't mind, I think, I think in these cases, when you move at extreme speed, then, and if you have a culture of break, that works with, break then fix, that works with certain technologies. You can kind of understand that in those cases. But then if you take something that's highly complex and, and has high impact like that, then maybe running at that breakneck speed is not the responsible thing to do, because the impact that you're going to have results in as you see, things like harassment, boundaries, etc. From a government policy, I have no idea, but what I will say is I'm yet to see a government move at any speed. So so there's a sort of an opposite problem there. So so let's kind of see what's in the middle. What I would say there is, and it's a really interesting one. Again, one of the things about if I take VR land for a second, right, is when you're in a VR experience and you're immersed, it feels really real. And when somebody is, it may not feel that way, but when you're interacting with somebody and they get really close, it really does feel like an invasion of privacy at that point, right? Is if somebody's in your personal space. And so I think those guards are important, but at the same time, that's something not just from a regulation point of view and a guardrail and a technology perspective, is what everybody's going to have to think about. What, especially as you introduce these into organizations, what are these social contracts that you need to have in place? Now, some of it might sort of be implicit, right? I mean, you know, you wouldn't jump on somebody or whatever in a workplace. So you know what, and you would give people personal space. So you know what, you shouldn't do it in VR land, right? But I think sometimes, unfortunately, these things need to be spelled out, right? And it's a sad state, but I think that happens. So to come back to your sort of point about training earlier on, I think these are really important elements of kind of training, and so everybody understands, you know, what is an acceptable kind of way to behave. I think one of the big things about Web3 is the technology, and you look at things like blockchain, etc., and the decentralized nature, though. I think these days, you know, I think there's still a huge amount of work to do, but then I think people are more accountable for their actions and they can't hide from it. So I think that's an important point. But yeah, that's my kind of view on that.
No, thank you for that, Chris, and nice for you to reflect on personal experience there as well of how it actually feels. I can't say I've been in the metaverse myself, so nice to hear what it's actually like as well. Laura, I just wanted to invite you to, if you wanted to comment on this last one before we try and take a couple of the questions that have come through from the audience. Is there anything you wanted to comment on this one?
So I think Christopher and Esther have done a really, really great job at kind of just showcasing just the importance that it is to address online harms. Just a couple of things to just think about from a policy perspective. So technology regulation, it's always a process of navigating that risk and reward, whether that's the metaverse, whether that's the internet, whether that's AR, VR, whether that's kind of your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. It's always about navigating that risk and reward, and that is something that can be done through having the right skills and having the right awareness to kind of make those decisions for yourself. From a business perspective, I think having responsible innovation practices is also incredibly crucial, right? So we've seen what it's like when people have kind of just rushed into something without kind of taking into account the process of responsible innovation. So businesses having that in place is just so fundamental in today's society. And then finally, just to add, any form of online harm regulation, it shouldn't be, because of the speed of change and the fact that Chris said governments find it hard to innovate alongside the speed of change. It shouldn't focus on a specific technology. It should focus on a process or a group of ideas, which means it can then be applied when it's needed to a technology that you and I probably haven't even thought about yet, or even thought about what that process of harm can look like in that new world. So rather than focus on a very specific technology, focusing on the processes and the ideas around it is crucial.
I wanted to say as well, Kate, that when I was at Southwest a couple of weeks ago, there was a panel talking about non-fungible intelligence, and I found this fascinating because a lot of what we're talking about here is about us still being in our physical presence with VR headset, you know, actually interacting in Metaverse. What they were saying was actually, if you have avatars, you can have cross-platform avatars, multiple versions of you imbued with AI, ML, who can be carrying out transactions, you know, interacting in the space. And I guess you have to question some of it of going, do we all really want to walk around with haptic suits and headsets? Or would we want to have 5-star cross-platform, you know, avatars sorting out our direct debits, doing all this so we can all go to the pub? So, you know, so I was quite excited for that. I was like, can we get to that bit?
Very good question. Paul, are you able to see any of the questions from the audience, and could you read one out? We'll try to get answers a bit snappier, just so I know we're running close to time.
Yeah. So we got one early on from Kitty Hung, who has said, is it true that we need 6G in order to support Web3? I think speaking technically, not that I know a massive amount about it, but I believe the answer to that is no, since we are already, I mean, sure, any technology which has a wider bandwidth is going to help, because we are talking about more bandwidth intensive technologies. But as it stands at the moment, you can do it on a smartphone. Most of them are on 3G most of the time. So I think the answer realistically is no, not at the moment. That's at least my personal view. And the next one, which is a little bit more complex, is so Hisham Abugrad has asked, could you please explain how universities can adopt such technologies in their curriculums as universities are preparing the students to be employed and ready for UK industries?
So we partner with a lot of universities, both in the UK and internationally, because they recognise you are going to have to upskill, retrain 2-3 generations of teachers. So actually the universities, in the same way with governments, are struggling to work at the speed that they need to, and they are actively partnering with us because they see campus as a way of augmenting their learning for the employability skills for this space.
And just very quickly to add to that, partnerships for universities, so partnering with industry to make sure that students have the opportunity for internships and work placements is going to be crucial.
Yeah, really valuable point there as well, Laura. So we did have one backup question, but I think we're running a bit too close to time to introduce it.
I think you're right, which is really unfortunate because it's a very interesting one, but we'll have to save that for the next time.
For the next event. But yeah, I will stop sharing, but I just wanted to say an absolutely massive thank you to all 3 of our speakers for being so engaged and for offering so much insight into something that I've not myself experienced, but I do feel like I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure, Paul, you'd say that too.
Absolutely.
Thank you to the audience as well for posting your questions on the chat functionality there. We managed to answer a couple of them, but yes, thank you so much for your time, guys, and yeah, hopefully see you at the next event.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Thanks,
see
everyone.
you all.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye now.
Bye.